make you stand, Ryan. But first, I want to have our back-to-back here, our panel discussion to go with. So I don't know if we can change the slides, or I forget where this is controlled. I don't know where it is in there. Nick will figure it out. But we'll invite up our panelists here. We're going to have Katrina is going to join us. I think Alex is sitting in the back. Alex Coulombe, Katrina Johnston-Zimmerman, and then filling in because Nigel Jacob had a professional emergency and couldn't join us today. But Marlon Fuentes from Leia has been kindly agreed to join our session at the last moment. So I would invite the three of you to come up on stage. We'll negotiate the mics and work out the whole panel there in just a second. So grab a seat, Katrina. And I might just ask you a question first when we get up here. Alex is coming up from the back. Okay, so quickly, as a place to get started, Katrina, you have the best title of anybody I know, and I love collecting titles, which is you are an urban anthropologist. So I'm curious, as an urban anthropologist, how do you react to this? Because basically what is it like to be a virtual urban anthropologist? And also, my biggest question from Ryan's takeaway of this is how do real-world norms and mores and human interaction, is there a one-to-one between that virtual environment of avatars walking around a virtual space back to how we use the urban realm? How translatable is it? We'll come to our digital experts in a moment, but I want to ask the urbanist on the panel to start. Like, is your immediate reaction skepticism, or is it hopefulness, or what is your thought here about how translatable are these ideas?
Okay, I love that you just put me on the spot so hard after all that. My brain is like, wait a minute. But yeah, no, so first of all, I have to do that whole thing too about like, urbanism in cities around the world now and everything else, and we're all urbanists, right? So at this point, basically, this is what I say all the time, like each of us does, the community is the expert. We have an understanding about what we need, what we like, what works for us, what doesn't. We might not be able to talk about that all the time, but we can illustrate it, And sometimes we illustrate that with our actions, places we like to live in, the way in which we traverse through a space, and we can observe that. And that's what I do as an urban anthropologist, more often than not, basically see the story through the behavior and also that combination of community engagement. So if we have a forum that's online that is like giving us the ability to really discuss these things, that's fantastic. Of course, it's not totally translatable necessarily, right? You can't always interact with the environment in the same way you do as a person, in a real city. And actually, so I was spending some time. I'm one of the first Roosevelt Island people, by the way. This is my first time. I lived in New York City for like 6 years ago, and I never came here. But it's wonderful. It's lovely. But I was playing around in this space that's outside this building. And, I think that's like one of the key things, right? The ability to play. So I did love that, the ability to, play around with the environment and so forth. But nothing beats just being able to also, like climb on structures like I was doing out here, right? Like how tall is this thing? Can you actually jump up on it? Like, what does that physicality feel like for you as a human being? Like, what are our limitations? But I do appreciate the ability to dream. So to answer your question for this quick summary here, I love it as a person who also is involved in virtual realities of different kinds, not to the same extent. Has a lot of experience with video games. I was very early on the internet as a millennial, as a late stage or like grandma millennial, whatever you want to call it, right? I get it. It's definitely, I think, a useful tool. But yeah, I'd like to see how it translates in the example that you gave, how it will actually translate to the physicality once it is constructed.
Thank you. I would say we'll definitely have a question for Ryan when he comes back up here, because I think you left, to me, the most interesting piece was at the very end, which is the asset packs, which I think gets to some of the interesting stuff here about Spectra and NUMENA building a virtual reference city, and then you're going to have to apply it back to the real world. So to me, there's going to be all sorts of interesting questions of how do you take reference designs, format them to specific projects, and tie those two together. But that's where we have our designers up here. So Alex and Marlon, probably need no introduction to the XR folks in the room, but I'm on the urban side, so Katrina and I have done many panels. Alex, I'd like you to start. I guess obviously briefly explain what you do, and then your take on this and this overarching question of really like what have you learned from urban design? What can urban designers learn from your practice, and how do we make this a more fruitful conversation?
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, Greg. So my name's Alex Coulombe. I run a studio in New York City called Agile Immersive Design. My background is in architecture and theater. I started working for such firms as Raphael Vignoli Architects, Zimmer Gunzel Frask Architects, among others. And then when the Oculus Rift DK1 first came out, I was working at Fisher Dax Associates Associates Theater Planning and Design, which is a consultancy that entirely focuses on designing theaters around the world in partnership with DSR and many others. We worked on the Shed in Hudson Yards, for example. And virtual reality in 2013 with the Oculus Rift DK1, for me, was immediately just a way to save time, money, headaches. I had so many meetings where we were trying to convince people, the plan that we've laid out, this is a good plan for what this theater is going to look like. And they'd kind of like, yeah, okay, but, or we'd show them renders. Here's the thing. We could show them a rendering of what a seat view would look like. And they'd be like, it really looks like that's a bad seat because the stage looks really far away. And we'd kind of say like, well, no, the stage is 40 feet away. Like that's a very normal distance to be away from the stage. Or they'd be like, the head in front looks like it's really close to you. Won't that be really uncomfortable? And it's like, no, it's a 3-foot row distance. Like that's totally standard in theaters. And immediately the idea of using virtual reality was like, let's just drop people into the space and let them feel what that space is going to be like, to feel present in it. And then suddenly like all those kind of pedestrian questions vanished. And suddenly we got to have these more nuanced discussions about like, oh, the railing, it feels kind of interesting having it here. Could we get it a little bit higher? Is that still in code? And then we started to develop more and more interactive architectural experiences that allowed for, restraining something so that it stayed within codes, but maybe actually doing something like grabbing a railing, a virtual railing, and moving it around and saying, what about this? And then kind of propagate that algorithm to what would eventually become, the Revit file and the construction documents. And so we started very much in this world of like, let's just help create real architecture in the real world by using these emerging technologies, in particular virtual reality and interactive engines like Unity and Unreal Engine. And then over time, especially as we started to work more on virtual performances and virtual shows that had some relationship to real theaters, we also got to that place with architecture where we started to think, well, if architecture is primarily serving a certain function, it's a gathering space for people or it's encouraging certain behaviors, the architectural psychology that can come with that of making people feel a certain way and just establishing a certain kind of space that people want to spend time doing a certain activity in, we realized that for a lot of people, their brain doesn't really care whether it's a real space or a virtual space as long as you're triggering a lot of those same cues, which in fact is how a lot of architecture comes from in the first place. We're playing on these kind of reptile brain elements that make us want to be, up high in a mountain or in a tree or in a castle and starting to bring that out to like skyscrapers and more urban kinds of scenarios. And similarly in virtual reality, we can start to play on some of those parts of our brain that want to be in certain places. Andreea and I know someone named Jessica Outlaw who's done these incredible studies on being inside virtual spaces and how we still want things like being, closer to a perimeter or a wall, because that makes us feel safer when we don't have to worry about what's behind us. Even though in a virtual space nothing can actually hurt us, a lot of these behaviors are still very similar. And I'd love to talk a lot about the ways we've been thinking about how virtual design wants to be skeuomorphic and take a lot of cues from the real world or go off into its own direction. But I'll just pause here for a moment by saying that what makes me really excited about the potential of all this is we're developing these new languages that do work specifically in virtual environments now, and we're starting to, let's call it, onboard people into the possibilities of what it's like to use, columns and ceilings, not for keeping the weather out and holding buildings up, but for not even just aesthetic reasons, but other kinds of spatial purposes, and starting to space make in new and exciting ways. I'll stop talking there.
Excellent. Thank you, Alex. All right. Well, before I set up Marlon for that one, to continue that question about like the virtual languages that you're seeing as well, I should also note it's funny. It occurred to me today, particularly when Andreea mentions KPF and I mentioned the various architecture firms. I know folks from HOK are here. I think someone's from KPF here. It was nearly 10 years ago that I actually helped Fast Company organize when SimCity did its first massive refresh a long time. We organized a multiplayer tournament, and KPF sent the team that designed Songdo, South Korea. Nice. So watching actual architects roll in with like urban design diagrams and like crush their competition in SimCity was very fascinating. So there was a lot you could learn actually from that practice. But Marlon, first, I'd love to hear your thoughts on too on what because this notion of transference and which Andreea mentioned earlier today, we were talking at Cornell Tech about what behaviors can go back and forth between, and Alex hinted at that, and Katrina as well. I'm curious, what are you seeing? Like, what are the behaviors that are transferable, and what should we be encouraging?
Yes, absolutely. Well, first of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Marlon Fuentes. I'm an ethnographer by training, currently working at Leia Inc. My exploration into emerging technologies and immersive content specifically, started when I worked in theater, actually, many years ago. My first Google Cardboard and Ricoh Theta camera. I don't know if anybody else, started in those days. But that, ultimately led me to working with communities to help basically tell their story. So I started with neighborhoods in Watts in Los Angeles, which later evolved into more immersive cultural work with communities outside the U.S., for example, in Trinidad and Tobago. That ultimately kind of led my career into sort of like a tech liaison for communities. One thing that's been very interesting for me is sort of like the perception that we have of like the needs of others, right? And so this particularly, hit home. I was couple of roles ago, I was working as the global music manager at the Grammys, and the perception, sort of the armchair sort of intellectual, like within the institution, had a very interesting perception of what culture and community and identity was in other parts of the world. And so, after all of these years traveling to different places and co-creating with communities and really taking their input and, being a professional guest, as ethnographers call themselves, has really, for me, kind of concretized like the idea that that we have to build with communities, that we have to empower them to do this work themselves in order to avoid sort of this this gaze that we may have as experts and practitioners. Just look at where we are right now. Take a pause and just consider where we're at right now. And so when we're building for others, this is something that's very important for me. In terms of architecture and urban design, I am somebody that became aware of this field really through the work of Jan Gehl. Anybody here read Monocle magazine? Big fan of the Urbanist, and I've learned a lot from these editorial publications. So I would say, like, I'm a layperson with a very deep interest. I'm a stakeholder in placemaking, that is for people, and so I bring all of this together, in order to, really help, create space and also co-create with different communities.
Great. All right. Well, now I'm going to go back to the question. Katrina, I'm going to basically take the question I posed to you at the beginning. Let's flip it around now because, there's a couple directions we can take it in. And I should know for the audience what we're going to do is I'm going to chat with them for the next 30 minutes. And then at 4:30, we'll bring back up Ryan and Andreea, and we'll do sort of group Q&A. And I would love to hear all the questions in this room because it's such an amazing group of practitioners in here. But obviously the question I want to come back to, there's sort of two. So one, the first question is, I think the most provocative thing that obviously came out of Andreea and also out of Ryan was talking about bottom-up communities. If this were Cornell AAP, we would have to have a question that would start something like, whither the architect's role in this? But because we're at Cornell Tech, we don't have to have that conversation. We can just talk about what are the freeing possibilities where you can actually do co-design or collaborative design and opening up all sorts of design possibilities and affordances that would not be dictated by traditional architects working in architecture practice. So this is a question for all three of you. You can all jump in to start with this, but let's consider that question. One, like, what possibilities open up with collaborative design? And then that second question, which I started to answer there, like, this transference between gaming and and urban space. What, particularly what do we want to transfer out of gaming into urban space? Like, what would the world be like if we borrow some more of those norms, of the possibilities? I mean, some of the things that Andreea was showing about players designing the environments, players changing the scale. There's a lot of possibilities there that we can't obviously explore in a built environment as much. But having two theater designers up here, I didn't realize I had theater people here with me as well. So I don't know, who wants to take first? You have a couple different directions and bite off a piece.
Okay, well, I do have to jump in just to say that I also started in fine art, not theater. But I am, I thought I was going to be an artist. I do oil painting, and there's a kid running against the thing. There, see? So, sorry, that's what I do. But I do oil painting and charcoal drawing, very classical art. Didn't think it was going to be good for a career path. Went into art history, found that to be incredibly boring. No offense to art historians. And then worked my way into anthropology. And so my foray into urbanism was from that lens of anthropology. I did archaeology, linguistics, everything, sociology. I did an ethnographic study and so on. And then I came across the work of Jane Jacobs and Holly White and Jan Gehl. And so that's really what got me into it, because they were basically doing anthropological research. And so I think a part of what was most interesting about that project for me too is, I do spatial ethnographies is what I call it. So an ethnographic study on not a group of people like a subculture, but on a place and a space in particular, because it's always unique. Every space is unique depending on the people that are there and the design elements, right? So there's sort of that, and I just had to shout out the art thing too. And then I forgot your second question.
You can answer those questions in turn. Well, we'll come back to you in that particular regard here. But gentlemen, your thoughts on this, on either sort of the notion of like let's focus for example on the collaborative part. So here I'll break up my questions here. But I'm going to talk about basically what happens when it goes from, because you started, Alex, what you described at the beginning I think is fairly traditional in the sense of like let's educate the client by doing it this way. Now let's like going to Andrea's point, which I think is like what happens when the client moves the wall and suddenly the architect is simply just standing there while the client is directing it, and we start changing the entire workflow and relationship there. So what possibilities does that open up?
Yeah, one thing that I've learned over the years, and maybe a few of us have, is architects don't always want to let the client have this level of agency or to even get this big of a peek of what the design will be like, because A, they want to maintain some element of mystique, and also they might say, oh, that's terrible. Whereas if you hide things behind very perfectly framed renders or the abstraction of orthogonal drawings, maybe there can be something that an architect is like, I really want to have this one detail exist, but no one's going to know about it until construction happens, and hopefully they want to put in a change order for it. But when we start to collaborate together, there are some really magic moments. Andreea brought up the notion of changing the ceiling height. That's something I've done a lot with architects and clients, and that's wonderful. Just saying what feels right. You don't have to talk about what's the exact dimension of it, just what feels like a good height for a space. One thing I want to bring up very briefly about collaborating together too, there's something called XR Social Club, which is just this weekly group of people who get together, usually in VR chat, to just hang out and do a cool thing and maybe travel to some virtual spaces, virtual worlds, virtual cities. I don't have a lot of love for Meta or Horizon Worlds, but there was one very cool experience that hits on what Greg is bringing up here, where Horizon Worlds does have a collaborative world editor. And so I did have an experience when I opened that up for the first time where it was me, Paul Debevic, who's like a CG legend and also just has a lot of great ideas about how virtual spaces should work, Deirdre Lyons, who's a straight-up theater person, and then just our friend Sam, who you don't need to know about Sam. But the idea was that we're just a group of friends, we're in a blank canvas space, and we're given these tools to collaboratively start to design the space together. And it started out as kind of a single space, felt a little bit like a playground, and over time, after an hour and a half, suddenly it started to feel more urban, it started to feel more like a city, and we were all putting our own touches on it. And here's the other thing, is in that editor, you can change your scale. So you can very quickly jump back and forth between human scale and kind of God mode dollhouse scale. And so you see some people doing these very grand gestures of skyscraper level, and then someone's there modifying a chair. And the fact that there were 4 of us all in there at the same time making these different design decisions and responding to each other was very exciting. And I wish I had more stories about doing that kind of thing with more architects and clients. But the potential of doing that in virtual spaces is really tremendous, and I'm looking forward to seeing more of that. The closest I've gotten to that in other contexts is using tools like Gravity Sketch, Masterpiece VR, and Tilt Brush, which now in its open source capacity has a multiplayer mode. And what's quite nice about that is there's a lot less pressure to do something that is accurate. You can be more gestural. It can be much more what about something that feels like this? And you're just making these sketches. And it reminds me of this idea of in architecture and urbanism, we often have the napkin sketch, which is oh, look at this beautiful party. This is what the space will be. And you're trying to evoke a sense of the potential of it. But when you do that in these virtual reality drawing applications, you're spatializing that. You're making it a sketch that you can now exist inside of and think about the human scale and the sequence of moving from one space to another. This space is very tight, 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 and then it opens up and suddenly it's you're in Grand Central, and you can feel that with just a few lines. And so doing that collaboratively as well, whether it's with other professionals or people who just are imagining what it'll be like to use a space, is very powerful.
Yeah. Marlon.
Yeah, absolutely. Very early in my career, I would lead design thinking workshops. This is when design thinking was a very, very, very popular buzzword, right? Not that it isn't anymore.
I love that we all speak of those years with a bit of shame now. It's really interesting to hear that sort of wincing, by the way.
Well, I started doing a lot of these workshops with Lego, right? And I would bring in stakeholders from hospitals, different, public sector spaces. And actually, one of the things that was the most challenging was just to get them to stop answering emails and actually just, participate. And so, one of the things that I think is really important, in this case of co-creating, especially with diverse set of stakeholders, very important people, very, everyday people, et cetera, different abilities, is the motivation and incentives to participate in the playmaking space, in the design space. And I go back to those years because I do remember, having to remind these execs, hey, a child can do this, you can too. And even that was a challenge sometimes. But beautiful things happen when stakeholders come together and begin to speak the same language and align and see the same things. In theater, one of the challenges was always, oh, well, we'd like to, make this play go outside of the building, but, will the neighbors next door, the businesses across the street, say it's okay. In Los Angeles, where I live my formative years, Department of Cultural Affairs often plays this liaison role, in activating spaces and talking to business owners. But I think in terms of designing together and utilizing these wonderful tools that we have, here for demonstration today, I think there does need to be sort of incentives, motivations, and just an all-around sort of buy-in from different diverse stakeholders, in order to participate.
Okay, I want to follow up with that
Go
too.
ahead.
So on the co-creation, not just my art background, so I want to take us way back for a second too, right? So if we think about ancient history, the first cities that humans actually lived in, which is a part of my so my problem as an anthropologist is my scope is just so wide all the time. I'm like, guys, we've been around for hundreds of thousands of years and millions of years collectively, evolving on this planet. It's fine, but in terms of cities, it's less than 10,000 years, right? So if we look at the very first cities that we were able to make ourselves, given a set number of parameters, what we're really looking at are the new places that are being built. I don't want to call them new urbanism because I don't think that is the proper way to talk about these things, but they are car-free, of course. They're very small. They're just basically a commune. They were just buildings pushed together, very human scale, and we didn't have a lot of technological advances to go beyond much of that capacity, right? So what I think is important in this discussion is the framework. And I know it said tools, not rules. But I think that humans need that limiting framework because we will do what we're able to do. And if we're able to build really, 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 really tall skyscrapers, we're going to do it even if it's just for fun or for, popularity contests or whatever have you. So that I think is, it sounds really bad sometimes to talk about social engineering vibes, but guess what? We really do kind of have to curb ourselves and give ourselves that framework to work in. So
that's really fascinating. So when you start framing it that way and go back that far, a phrase I just wrote down because I think of it as virtual dawn of everything. Is if you know the Graeber and Wengrow book about rethinking basically sort of communal experiments in the arc of civilization and cities. You can't, of course, run back the clock, but now perhaps you can build virtual worlds to go run your own virtual dawn of everything, which I think is really interesting. And the other one that jumps out at me, also thinking of the intersection of Ryan and Andreea, what they talked about is, and possibilities of this from an urban perspective is Baugruppen. I'm surprised it didn't come up there. If you're familiar with the German practice of bringing together 40 or so would-be homeowners to collectively design a multifamily house, these are the kinds of tools you want to build with Baugruppen. There's some really interesting areas there. We could talk more about that, but I do want to ask, 15 or so minutes here. This is, of course, a school, Cornell Tech, and we are, of course, training students here for jobs and, for actual practical skills. And so this is going to be the good motherhood and apple pie question for each of you from your perspectives, which is, what are the implications here for practitioners in this regard and how to think about this? Because, again, this is a sort of exciting and also perhaps threatening notion to traditional architects. But, it opens up a lot of interesting porosity between technologists. Andrea's point about I love the learning to code, bad for your professional career arc there at the time. But here, there's a lot of interesting opportunities between the two. And so I'm curious, I want to hear from each of your perspectives about the implications of what you heard here and what it means for your profession and how it applies to and expands your practice area. I don't know, who wants to take that first? Katrina, let's start with the Urbanist again.
Okay, so yeah, thank you for that because I think that's where my brain is going right now, all the gears turning about how to actually use this in practical application. So over the last year, I was a data fellow for the city of Philadelphia, working within the Smart Cities department, and as a sort of in-house researcher consultant person, essentially doing UX design and research or systems thinking or whatever the heck you want to call it, to basically come up with a data privacy and equity policy for the city. So that's just really interviewing a lot of people, coming up with best case scenarios and, trying to avoid pitfalls or whatever, and think about the public and the public need and why we need this technology. So tech for tech's sake, sake, I like hate that so much, right? I get that. I mean, again, I use a lot of tech too, obviously, but you know, what is really the best case scenario for this? So I am transitioning into a new job. I'm about to start as the assistant director for the South Street Head House District, which is a business improvement district in Philadelphia, with 400-ish businesses. I should know that better. 525 exact students. That was like amazing. Anyway, but the point being, I'm talking about a street, right? I'm talking about a neighborhood. I'm talking about a small slice of a city. And I'm talking about the people that I have to try and work for in that new role, which is supposed to be economic development, but is really just like better quality of life, right, in that location to make it better for everybody, the people that live there, the four surrounding neighborhoods, the businesses, whatever. So in my example there, I would say, please give this tool to the people so that they can see the better way of going about a main street, the better way to have like a car-free activated street that would improve business vitality, yada, yada, you know, make it a lovelier place, because that's a problem, is convincing somebody that that actually, you know, is a good thing. So it's also co-creation. It's like, yeah, absolutely. Like, where would you like to see, you know, this kind of seating or what, you know, trees and so on and so forth. But it's really, most of it is really just about being able to witness it and feel like you're there in order to say, yeah, this is a viable thing. I think we should work towards this, because otherwise that's just a heavy, heavy lift.
So just to quickly summarize, so you're basically seeing that as someone who is a sort of manager of bid, then they're basically putting and democratizing really powerful tools into your hands to lead as sort of a community manager engagement of this versus team rendering.
Because we already know what works in so many different capacities. There is actually enough research on a lot of things at this point. I mean, it's back to basics. It doesn't have to be a super fancy thing. We really just have to be very hands-on about our urban environments. That's what we want, person to person, et cetera. So the tool for the technology is a tool to convince people about that on the ground, in person, human to human, better city environment.
Okay, well, that's a really, really great point, and something we might discuss later. I think it's really interesting that this is an interesting moment also with generative AI, because also there's groups like in New York, Transform Your City, and others that are using Midjourney and those tools to also visualize that and produce beautiful renderings, et cetera. But with different capabilities. Alex, Mara, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well. Obviously, sort of basically, how do you take, well, yeah, either direction. How do you take, you know, the urban and architecture principles that you've learned into video game design or immersive environment design to make it improve those worlds, so we can get beyond the zombie landscape of Horizon worlds and others, and actually build a metaverse we want, and then also vice versa. I'm curious what you're carrying back. So Alex, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. And I'm so mad that you brought up AI, because like that's a whole other tangent that I'd love to go down a big rabbit hole on. And this whole idea of curation versus creation and all that. But suffice to say, all of this goes toward yes, this notion of a toolbox, that we have these additional tools and we should know how to use them. You don't need to use it for everything, but you should know when it makes sense and when to use them. I started doing theater primarily because even when I was in architecture school, I just got so bogged down thinking about how long it takes for a building to be constructed. Versus theater, you can write something down and have actors performing it 5 minutes later, and the next week it's in front of an audience. And that kind of rapid iteration of creation was very satisfying. And as soon as we started to use more of these digital tools and started to use Unreal Engine, Unity, VR chat, various social platforms to start to get ideas off the ground, that rapid iteration, as Ryan beautifully alluded to at the beginning of his presentation as well, is such a wonderful sandbox to be testing out ideas. And even if you or students or anyone has no desire to exist in a Ready Player One kind of metaverse in the future, these are still valuable tools for the real world. These are places where you can test out ideas. You can have virtual users in a space that is totally representative, a digital twin of a real space you're trying to design, and you can start to get that user feedback of like, how do they behave in the space? Do they go to the places that I think they're going to? And there's so much to be garnered from that still helps you create better architecture spaces, urban communities in the real world. But if you do see a future where, hey, maybe I also want to be a master builder who creates some spaces that exist entirely virtually, the training that you have working in these disciplines is invaluable for putting that together. A lot of the virtual spaces in the world right now are not very good. And that's because most of the people creating these are hobbyists, and they don't have the kinds of design thinking or the training or even the interest to go and read, towards a new architecture or whatever, to start to interrogate and grapple with these ideas to determine for themselves what is their design philosophy and what do they think makes a really compelling space. They're kit bashing, they're grabbing a bunch of assets off the Unity asset store or wherever and saying like, there's a chair, there's a table, there's a wall, cool, I made a space, let's publish it. And on the one hand, I love that we are democratizing these tools and making it that easy for anyone to do this, but just because anyone can do it doesn't mean anyone should do it. So I do want more of us out there, as much as possible, creating these virtual environments, because the rate at which they're being created and generated, whether it's in the social platform or a video game or something that's just a VR experience, is mind-blowing. How I'm sure there's statistics out there, like the rate of virtual spaces being constructed versus physical ones. But suffice to say, the percentage of those virtual ones being created being good is so low that I feel like there's a call to action for as many of us who have the ability to construct well-designed, meaningful, thoughtful virtual spaces to do so. Really should. That would be my hope.
It's really fascinating. We'll come back to this in a second because it frames it to me. So you answered one of my questions, which is lurked over my head, which is, but what if everyone's ideas are bad? Like, that's the one I keep getting hung up on. And obviously it becomes a question of curation, which I want to come back to, of whether this changes the role of both directions, from pure creation, having to build these environments, to now we're just curating, going back to the asset pack model, whether it's AI generating infinite numbers of outcomes or we're massively crowdsourcing, et cetera. But sorry, Marla, I don't know if I'm stepping on you there, but I'm curious your thoughts on this as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, this reminds me of Alvin Toffler, Future Shock, 1974, I think it was? 70. That was a book that really inspired me and actually, really kind of gave me a mandate for acclimating people to the future instead of having the future be something that happens to you. And so one of the things that, I think is really important is to your point, be a community manager. If we think about ourselves as like, well, I am a human resource in the age of, rapidly accelerating AI. How do I add value here, right? And I think it is going to be that human relationship with other people that, invites them to participate in these different methodologies and with these different technologies, right? And so, I think that we all have a responsibility, especially as practitioners. Everybody, if you're in this room right now, you're in many ways kind of living in the future as far as like the tools and technologies that you have access to. And so I think for all of us, we do have a responsibility to each one teach one, as they say. But I think it's increasingly important to have more participation, and as these tools become more sophisticated, for us to be able to, make space and create opportunities for other perspectives to join in. I think coming from a very cultural background, I can already see how missing a lot of the world's expressions and identity is from these digital spaces. And I celebrate every time that I see a glimpse of somebody's authenticity in these spaces. A VR project that I worked on several years ago was based on a short story written by my father about the different styles of sleeping on the Mexico City metro. And these are the types of stories that can really create kind of an opportunity for us to think about culturally relevant spaces and memories. And I can go on and on about how that particular, it was basically a quill story, for VR, narrated. But I think we can really think outside the box and really invite people to kind of put in their grain of sand, so that we can all better understand each other and our needs.
Thank you, Marla. It just occurred to me that your grandfather was Carlos Fuentes.
Not my grandfather.
Oh, sorry, your father? Sorry, I missed that.
My father's Jose Fuentes. He's a writer from Mexico City.
Oh, okay. Yeah. For a moment, I was thinking the essayist there. I was like, yes, there's raconteurs, and then there's Carlos Fuentes as well. No, I guess segues beyond the curation. I'd love to ask each of the three of you your thoughts on. Okay, so we've built or curated or created these incredible virtual architectural environments. how do we link them back into the decision-making process as it dictate what gets what built in the real world? Like, not just, of course, showing what works there, but like, how do we use that to implement change, or how do we basically tie that back into some of those systems? Whether that just means pure software, about like how do you tie it into existing systems, so whatever we harvest out of a virtual world, but also, I guess, in the sense too of like, I don't know, I think about the fact that, for example, like Horizon World is empty and all the devils are here, and we also see lots of unloved places in the real world too. Like, how do we define what is a successful environment in the virtual space? How do we prove it out? Is it simply going to be a question of, driving traffic to it and measuring those impacts? Like, how do we prove out those sort of metrics and KPIs that say this is a design that people will love if we bring it and we build it in physical space versus just something that exists virtually, if that makes sense. Alex, you're nodding the most, I guess. You can take that first.
Yeah, that's a good question, because, of course, when a space exists digitally, there's a lot more we can do to measure it and different rubrics for success. We can see hotspots of the areas and things that people look at or where they spend time. But there is this interesting question of how often can a virtual and physical space compare one-to-one. Like, there could be a space that is super, super popular in VR chat, and you build that space in the real world and no one cares and it's unloved and abandoned. And I don't have an answer for like how you best beta test, for example, a physical space using digital tools, and then see success, magically materialize in the real world. What I do find is that a lot of times when designing these spaces, there's a lot that you can learn, of course, from all the ways that we're trained in traditional space making. But then if you start to actually go in more of a direction of saying, like, I want this space to exist entirely virtually, and now I'm going to do things like, change what human scale is in the space, or I'm going to give people the ability to fly. And you don't go too far down that rabbit hole, because then you feel abandoned in that space and you just don't know how to engage with it. But if you start to onboard people into this world where you can have very specific ways to enhance a space that only works well in the digital environment, then at least I know on that end, you can start to have some really exciting, I want to say, progression from things that are very familiar to something that is very successful and entirely digital. I'm curious what you guys have to say.
Sometimes I'm very into democracy. Sometimes I'm into philosopher kings and queens, right? I think, going back to sort of this idea of like having access to participate, good college friend of mine, Stephen Corwin, some years ago created an app called City Grows. And basically, they created almost like a Twitter-style thumbs up or down for communities to vote on new developments that were going to be installed in their neighborhoods. The problem that they were solving was really the fact that a lot of the paperwork that was being done, in City Hall wasn't ever going out into the public in any sort of meaningful way, right? Unless you're showing up to neighborhood council meetings and things like that, free pizza often, those types of things. They usually don't have that information. And so, it's interesting to think about, how well informed are these folks about, these theories that, we can all talk about, I think for me, sometimes it's going backwards, like with work of Yangel. That was something that really inspired me, was, kind of hearing his his perspective on just spontaneity and, meaningful places for interactions and invitations for interaction and things like that. It was almost kind of like rejecting a super modern, high-tech approach to city building. But I think that, I think popularizing architecture and popularizing urban design and making it participatory and utilizing, the technology, as was the case with City Grows, I think will give us a step towards inclusive, design from informed people. I think this information, these knowledge bases shouldn't be just in academia. I think that this should be very popular stuff, and so I think my hope is that through that process, more people can find excitement for urban design and architecture, just like I did, discovering even architecture magazines at a newsstand. So I think that would be my approach. Inform people participating, and us professionals making it possible for them to access the information.
Okay, a couple things. I think, one, there's the accessibility that you're talking about there, right? Making the information accessible, democratizing that to some extent, or what you called one of your major principles, which was Post-disciplinary, whatever word we're using these days. I love that. So there's that idea in terms of like everybody being the expert or whatever have you. But then again, there's this framework concept, right? So I think that there is this huge difference between what is and what should be, sort of what can be and what should be. But we do have to have some kind of bumper track for where that's going to go. And I think there's also something to be said about something is going to be successful in some ways because it has to be. Do you see what I'm saying here? It's like, so between the ancient, not the ancient, whatever, the gods of urbanism, like Yangel, my modern inspiration that I talk about all the time now is Ada Colau, the first female mayor of Barcelona, who made the superblock system. And the principle behind that is the right to the city, which is that we all have a right to the city, which is not otherwise built into this normal day-to-day interaction or involvement or habitation in an urban environment. We don't think of it like an ecosystem. Like we don't think of it in that sense as like we just really don't. So Ada Colau's guiding principle behind what she's doing is that this needs to happen and needs to be a success because it's going to decrease air pollution, noise pollution, prevent car crashes and child mortality, right? Obesity and so forth. Like that this is going to create social spaces that will give us a more thriving urban environment, and that has to be done for the betterment of public good and health. So you can try something and then measure the metrics and see if it's a success, but sometimes these things take time. And really sometimes you do have to transfer over the normalization of that cultural aspect that you're trying to impose upon the people in some way, because we do have to undo a lot of damage, right? So that's why so much of it is a convincing exercise in my mind. And quite frankly, a lot of it really is going to have to be a stick to it exercise, whether you like it or not, because some of this is going to literally have to happen.
Well, I'm particularly glad you invoked the right to the city, because my favorite formulation of that is David Harvey's, which is a more strident gloss on what often gets attributed to Jane Jacobs, and he defines the right to city as the right not only to transform the city, but to be transformed by it ourselves, like to have access to that. And in virtual spaces, it becomes a very interesting question here about who regulates that. That's, I think in the States, it's like almost like an FTC issue, and that will be played out. But that's why I come back to my interest with the Metaverse Metropolis project, thinking about augmented reality. What happens when increasing capabilities and perhaps rights and things are layered digitally on top of it? How do we ensure that people have a right to that virtual city as well? And then we have those possibilities. So thank you for framing that. All right, I'm gonna stop talking, and what we're gonna do now is I'm gonna drag another chair up on here on stage so that both Andrea and Ryan can take a seat, and then perhaps Nick and I will run around. I'll run with the microphone to ask for questions, because this is perhaps the most interesting mix I've ever had for an audience. I just wanna call out two people. You don't have to answer questions, but I think it's the first audience I've ever had that has Cornell Tech's own Harold Haraldson in the back, who runs our XR Collaboratory, which basically explores really granular interactions and technologies with XR. And also Ethan Kent's here. We use the word placemaking in the title, and so Ethan Kent appears. I love it. So we have like placemaking incarnate, we have XR incarnate, and everything in between. So, all right, so on that, I will come on up here. Andrea, take a seat. Let me get a chair, Ryan. Does anyone have any questions? This is your time. Please start thinking. We got one in the back. I will come over here while someone brings up a chair. Thank you, sir. And let's get this party started here in audience Q&A.
Get your own chair, Ryan.
Self-service.
Yeah, whatever works.
Hey, everybody. So I know we're at a place which is like an intersection. Oh, I'm Henry Kaiser, Democratize XR. I know that we're at a place that intersects government and research and corporations, institutions, but I represent the media. And so as somebody who leads XR teams for major media companies and news media specifically, I've got like thousands of people trained nationwide who are ready to cover this type of like 3D content in their reporting. You know, after crime and sports, local development is the most covered topic in this country. So how do you all see your work and the work of urban designers and architects who are following your trailblazing work, using this with, handing it off, using it with the media industry as they cover development discussions?
Anyone want to jump on that? Perhaps Katrina, maybe? I don't know.
Why do you keep doing that to me?
Because I know you the best, and I know you can take it. That's why. I trust you.
Yes, but also, okay, well, maybe it's also an educational tool in that sense, right? I mean, again, I think, us urban nerds who, I mean, I feel like, when you say the Jane Jacobs quote, like ad nauseum, like, yeah. But a lot of people don't know that, right? And I think that, the easiest way to educate or to feel, is to feel something in that way. Like the best way to understand it fully is to experience it firsthand. So, I mean, I guess I talk about this sometimes too about all right, people go over to, vacation in Italy or wherever, Barcelona, et cetera, and then Amsterdam, and they come back home and they're like, wow, that was so amazing. I love that place. It's so lovely. And then they sort of get back into the American cultural element really quick. I mean, we're really adaptable as a species. That's why we took over the planet, right? And so we get really used to also our coping mechanisms of oh, JK, now I have to cross the street in this way, or get in my car and go to the grocery store. So if we can use that as a tool of no, look, it's right here. It could be used in this way. Remember that time you went to Venice and then, I mean, maybe that's the best way to think about it from the public standpoint.
So the question is how media can use this? How I guess how journalists can use this in their work? Yeah, I think if you're doing interviews, if you're doing interviews for a project, where do you find people normally? Do you go to a community board meeting? Do you just kind of walk the streets in a neighborhood and try to catch people? I think if you did actually have virtual reality, you could put them in it and get a reaction. I mean, it'll be very visceral. I think it's sort of interesting where you could have a conversation that's a lot more detailed and a lot more emotional, how they felt the new space, not just, people have a tie to the existing space and you have a hard time imagining how that's going to change. And your kind of gut reactions I don't want that to change. Whereas if you can actually experience something and you say, oh, that's actually kind of nice. So I think anything that in your interview subject's mind gives them a clearer picture and a clearer opinion, I think that's a useful tool.
As a quick follow-up, I mean literally, how can they start from what you are already creating and immediately adopt it? The same way you would provide renders today for the public discourse. How can they take the virtual work you're doing and immediately put that in the public discourse in their own channels?
In their own channels.
Go ahead.
Well, shout out to the New York Times. New York Times does an amazing job of bringing immersive technology, to the public. If anybody has seen some of their features that use photogrammetry and things like that, for me, the word is popularizing these technologies, to better understand spaces. And I think that's a really great example. It involves having, maybe a little bit more of a developer muscle on the editorial staff, to complement the journalistic, staff as well. But I think that's a great example.
Yeah, and I mean, quick shout out to Henry, who's done hundreds of pieces with Yahoo that were mostly AR and using WebXR, which is super accessible, which is great. We've had some good success, especially in the architecture side, of having accessible experiences usually embedded on a website that's promoting a project. That the key thing with this stuff is not everyone has a VR headset, not everyone wants to put on a VR headset, so having those different tiers that make something as accessible as possible. So we started back in 2013, 2014, doing a lot of architecture and real estate as 360 panos that you could view in YouTube or inside something like, there's a tool called KR Pano, which would allow you to do these very simple WebXR, real estate tours. And then the idea, of course, is you can just kind of navigate them around them in a browser if you want to, or on your phone with a touch screen, or you put on a VR headset and now it's stereo, and now you get a better sense of human scale and you can kind of go from there. Now in 2023, we do a lot more with cloud computing. We try to make things accessible by saying, hey, there is a very powerful computer in the cloud, and if you want to get a full photoreal, interactive, navigable version of this space that we're helping to design, you now have a way to interactively move through this using similar cloud gaming technology that we've seen from Google Stadia, GeForce Now, Xbox Cloud, but now it's being put to use for showing you a very robust visualization of a space that will be built.
Next question. Here, go ahead, Scott.
Thanks. Really more of an answer to the question that was asked than a question, if that's okay. There are theaters On the street, in the lobbies of buildings, in stores, there's digital signage everywhere, and it's proliferating. And the technology allows for very targeted delivery and measurement and engagement through QR codes and so on. And I would just suggest that that form of media, which is the most local form of mass media that's ever been invented, but which is also not a whole lot different from a use case perspective from broadsheets that were plastered in town squares, hundreds of years ago, ought to be used as a form of media for creating awareness, advocacy, support, and just providing information and engagement.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right, other audience questions? Or I can ask one. We got one way over there. All right, let me run over there. Literally run it here.
Getting your steps in, Greg.
I will.
Hi, I'm Hari from Geopipe. So I've heard today's discussion. I got to know a lot of use cases that use virtual world to build real world. I have a question of the inverse relation. Like, how important do you think is getting real world into the virtual space from your perspectives?
Yeah, I'd say it's very important, and the virtual world stuff that we're doing is not meant to just always live in the virtual world. It's meant to connect to the physical world. And so, when we're talking about raw land, we're talking about how do you create a scan of that land and bring that into the headset. When you're talking about infill development, you need the existing context. You need to have a good replication of the existing blocks that you're trying to develop next to. And so doing it accurately and quickly is very important. And I think what you guys are doing is really great. Before creating a digital twin cost a lot of money and took a lot of time. And so anything you can do to compress that, and I think that's the biggest change over the last, say, 2 or 3 years, to go from idea to virtual environment, whether it's photogrammetry, whether it's 3D modeled assets, whatever it is, and then to actually have a multiplayer environment that you're interacting with, that's getting easier and it's getting cheaper. And that means more applications open up and more people will use these tools. And so I think having a good representation of real spaces is just as important as being able to create virtual stuff, just purely virtual stuff.
Yeah, I invite everybody to check out the Leia demo after the session. One of the things that Leia does is that we use AI to convert 2D content to 3D. So, these are upgrades to familiar devices. We have the LoomPad 2 tablet over there, which is a 3D tablet, can go 2D and 3D. But, to your point, very easy to bring in, real life content, even streaming content. You can convert, a YouTube video of a performance in a particular place to 3D and create that sense of immersion. So I think that's going to get easier. And to your point, I think on display, on familiar devices, public space, I think would be wonderful.
Yes, Andreea, go ahead.
Sorry, I have an oddly specific answer to the how can the press use VR? Sorry to go back to that.
Go right ahead.
So we mentioned earlier how cities have been around for 10,000 years. There's consuming information in text form for everyone has actually been around for even less than that. So reading, writing, and having every single person on the planet get so much information daily in this written form or even video, right? Like that's just really, really, really new. We're doing it really well, and we figured out text tremendously well. That's also how we conquer the world. But what we know how to do even better is spatial and embodied cognition. We know how to find our way in a spatial environment. That's what we're designed for, basically, and we really excel at that. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with memory palaces and how many of you have tried the idea of a memory palace in a virtual environment. So the way I would like to consume my news, I would like to be in the city, and I would like the possibility to put all the headlines on this topic under a bench here, and I would like everything on this topic to be below this tree. You can consume tremendous amount of information if you spatialize it in that environment. We are so good at orienting ourselves there. And these experiments with memory palaces allows people, like ordinary people, to memorize hundreds of cards, playing cards in order. Like, that's how good we are. So that's what I would love to do.
I'm going to piggyback on that and just say I agree completely. If I had some kind of like virtual Jarvis, situation for my brain, that would be wonderful. So yeah, get on that. That'd be great.
Spatial GPT. Do we have other questions? Oh, let's see. All right, I'll go to that side and then come back to the two of you. So 1 second.
Hi, I'm Ritika Kapoor. I'm a senior designer at HOK. So, as architects and designers, we think of users in real space, about user experience. And then when we go in the virtual world, we become avatars or players. How do you think that transition becomes easier or good for a user if it gets readily adapted over the years?
Gesundheit. Oh, do you want me to also answer? I can also say my opinion. So I wanted to say this earlier, and I don't want to sound like a downer or anything with that in that regard, but I don't think it's ever going to translate completely. I really don't. I mean, there's so many nuances that we don't even understand about ourselves as humans, going back to these ways in which we spatially organize ourselves and so forth. I mean, there's electricity that we emit, like there's smells that we pick up on that we don't even know that we're picking up on, that kind of an idea. So like, that instinct around it, like those kinds of human elements, I don't think can ever be properly translated into a virtual world. I mean, it's going to take a lot to do that, personally. So I think that we can do this to the best of our ability as it currently exists and use it to whatever extent that we can, but I think that it can only go so far.
I can add quickly to that. I think it depends on the use of that space. So we have tremendous amount of brain plasticity. We can get used to things extremely fast. So if the point of the virtual world is to mimic physical reality for whatever reason, then I think we should go the route of humanoid avatars and do the best we can to get all the senses right in the right way and wire them correctly. But if the point of that virtual world has nothing to do with physical reality, then, oh my God, give me 5 tentacles, and we can actually control them with our fingers. There's amazing research coming out of that. Or I don't want to be embodied at all, or I definitely don't want to be humanoid. Now, when we design in VR, actually, it's super important for me to fly so I can reposition myself and control the building from different angles. So basically, I become the mouse. You know how when we use Rhino or Revit or whatever, we keep zoom and pan to reposition ourselves before we actually move a wall in 3D? That's what I do basically with my body. I have to fly around and reposition to find the best angle to do a certain operation on that wall. So I'm not humanoid. I am not navigating the space in any humanoid form. So there's a wide, humongous range of how being in a virtual space as an embodied person with a body in mid-space feels like, and why and which direction should you go in.
That's a good point, and that is also getting to a totally different subject, though, too, about, like, we do have a huge limitation with our bodies as well. Obviously, some people more than others. I mean, the bodies that we live in on this planet impact the way in which we live every day, obviously. So can you put yourself in somebody else's shoes to that extent? I think that's a better goal in mind, and that's, can you be a child? Like, can you be in a wheel device? Something along those lines. Can you have a mobility challenge that just makes it so that you look at the world differently if you're an able-bodied person? So how can you get into that other perspective? That, I would say, would be a beneficial aspect of that.
Very briefly, just piggybacking on all that, the uncanny valley, I think, is more pronounced in VR than in typical life. Little archviz people that look great in a rendering can be kind of terrifying and zombie-like in the virtual world. I think we actually do have the ability to get past that uncanny valley. We do a lot of stuff with metahumans and Unreal Engine where if it's well-designed, you can be right up close to that person in VR. You make that person very expressive, and you capture all the nuances of what their face is doing in the real world, and it feels good in the virtual world. That being said, oftentimes it does feel better to have something that's more stylized, more abstract. We did all these studies back in 2018 for Philip Rosedale, who was the founder of Second Life and then had a VR platform called High Fidelity, looking at ideal performer-audience interaction, different avatars, different spaces that people could engage in. And we found that some of the most compelling avatars were the ones that left more up to the imagination. We did a study with something called larval masks, where we only had a single expression on a face. You might think of like commedia dell'arte and things like that as well. And then we only represented the hand hands and the feet. Because one of the big problems with virtual bodies is IK, inverse kinematics, where, if you're in a VR headset and you have the position of your hands, oftentimes your arms, your legs, whatever, will be doing something weird, and it will feel unnatural, and it'll be distracting. So being able to say, here's where my hands are, here's where my feet are, whatever, and the rest is invisible, and it leaves everything else up to your imagination, that often actually feels pretty good. And you'd be surprised how often in VR our brains want to be using our imagination more. And one of the big pitfalls I often see in VR is like, let me show you everything, when in fact there are a lot of lessons to be learned from theater and stagecraft, and having some things in complete shadow or darkness, and letting your mind kind of fill in the blanks. There should be more of that.
Also, being human every day is boring once you realize you have choices.
Yeah.
I mean, your brain can do so much more stuff. So there's tremendous research showing that. So of course, we're still human, and we still have this kind of body that teaches us everything we know, and that will continue to be so. But there's just tremendous wealth in experiencing yourself in all these other ways, including disembodiment.
I love being invisible in VR, especially if I need to like move a prop back on stage. No one can see me doing it.
I also love being a human. I just want to throw that out there.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tice. I'm with In Situ. This is a question about something on one of Ryan's slides, but open for anyone. When you were talking about the sort of community experiments that are happening, a lot of these have been happening for decades, like these models. Like when I was in Oregon, I lived in a couple co-living houses that had been around since like the early 90s, but even decades before that. And my question is, how do we not just reinvent the wheel over and over and over with these communities? It's like, okay, we have like new tech, so like we must have to have new community models, and often it's probably just we need to look at some existing communities that are already happening. Like there's examples in Ithaca, and like I said in Oregon, like Intentional Community Network, I forget the exact name of it, has like all these communities across the world. How do we not just keep redoing the same things, but think that we have to because now we have new tech?
Yeah, not necessarily saying we have to redo those. There's a lot to learn from it. You saw Wild Wild Country. You mentioned Oregon. There's some lessons. There's some lessons, good and bad there.
Let's be clear.
But yeah, I think people have been coming together in these ways for years. In our white paper we reference the kibbutz in Israel as a prior, and so the ways communities have come together, I think there's a lot to learn in terms of how we make these new communities. I think one of the differences is that sometimes these communities form not even in the same place, right? So before it's like you're connecting with your neighbors, your cousins, your friends of friends in the same space. Now people are finding people that they're ideologically aligned with that may be on the other side of the planet. And that's obviously a phenomenon of the internet and social networks that emerged and just the age that we live in. And so I think these virtual tools become important when you're trying to coordinate from people all over the world. And so like having a community co-living dinner in a house is great when you're in the same space, and is probably better than anything that we could offer in virtual reality. Mm-hmm. But when you're dealing with coordinating people all over the world, that's not necessarily available. And so I think it's learning from those best practices in small co-living experiments that have existed for, as you said, decades or centuries or forever, basically. And adding new tools that allow coordination across a larger area. And then for me, it's like, okay, well, you've met in the virtual. I don't know about anybody else, but post-COVID, I have like a lot of chat groups where I got to know people very well, and I've only met them 0 times or 1 times, or, you have these now deeper connections with people virtually all over the world. Then it's like, okay, well, now I would actually like to connect physically. I would like to find a place that we could try to live together, right? And then it's recreating and reintroducing a lot of those forms that you mentioned before. So I think what's the new thing is just how spread our social graphs are now.
All right, I'm going to try to squeeze in a few more questions here. So,
mine was to kind of piggyback off of what you were saying, the strategy for cities. So is it that like the new kind of Google Maps to do the replica digital twin city, that then like who's going to pay for that? Is it the city that we need to onboard to go do the map of the entire city so we as the citizens can go play? And then like how do you democratize that? And then also, you see any of the games, Sims, or anything with the Metaverse right now, Sandbox, like it's a blank slate and we become the builders. And so what's your strategy there to get cities? Is that the main client? They have to pay for it just like Telos is going to go pay for it like they would an architectural rendering? Or is it over time? Because I'm assuming it's, kind of picking off of what he said, it is going to be expensive. And what's like the rollout for that?
If we have to wait for every city to set up a procurement and select a vendor and scan every inch, I'll be long dead by the time that happens. So I think this is going to be, primarily, folks like in situ, folks finding new tools, whether it's AI tools or photogrammetry-based tools to more quickly scan places. That said, I'm using, for the Puerto Rico property, we're using a publicly available data set. After Hurricane Maria, they took a LiDAR scan of the whole island. And we were able to pull that in and really quickly recreate the farm. So there's probably a place for the public sector to do it. And there's going to be cases where that makes sense. But I think largely it's going to be better tools, making it faster and easier, and then people in the private sector finding ways to do it and to finance it.
Yeah, I'd also say, look at the motivating factors. One thing I remember, I was in Tegucigalpa, Honduras, and I was giving a presentation about XR, and I showed the audience what Google Maps or Google Earth really was capturing as far as Tegucigalpa, and it was kind of a low fidelity image, not as high fidelity as other cities, right? And I was like, this is you. This is your city. How can you show up more on the map, And when you think about all the tools that we have in our pockets, I think it's quite incredible, what people are capable of. Now, thinking about motivation, so I think there's a strong sense of cultural pride and a sense of place and identity. And I think if we tap into some of those motivations for local communities, I think we'll see some pretty exciting outputs.
Maybe there's a way to gamify it and make have it be a social thing. Yeah.
But I think there's also a cautionary tale here, too. And to Greg's point earlier, and I was just kidding, I love you, Greg, but I can definitely take this. I mean, listen, this has been the pitfall of prior new urbanist ideas, right? And major tech solutions. Cities have spent, millions of dollars on, private companies, solutions to urban problems that have completely failed, that have violated public rights of equity and privacy. And urbanist ideas have also only been isolated to private development that's able to be purchased by an individual who wants to take on that risk, who is driving the entire project, and it's off the beaten path and so forth. So, unfortunately, that's what still seems to be the case. If this can be done differently, then I think that those issues and those, the bad ideas, those past mistakes, they need to be very seriously considered in order to do it better this time. That's all I'm saying.
Everyone should learn about Pruitt-Igoe and everything that happened there. There's a lot that everyone should be piggybacking off of and learning from.
All right, last question.
Hi. It seems like a lot of these technologies and tools are built on public data sets, open data, open kind of infrastructure and tooling. But at the same time, there are these private companies, startups, but also big players like Meta. What do you think the role is here of requiring or promoting open standards and tooling versus having private companies be able to make a business out of some of this?
I'd love if there was a game engine, at Unity or Unreal's level that was an open source tool.
Unreal's almost there. It's not totally open source, but you can do anything to that engine code that you want.
Yeah. I think there's going to be things that are going to be more open than others, and I think generally, particularly the idea of a metaverse, nobody wants to go to just Mark Zuckerberg's metaverse, right? We need interoperability. We need interoperability in terms of devices, in terms of places and spaces. I think from my perspective, we chose to do the Creative Commons open source license on all the assets. So we went pretty extreme in that direction. And hopefully the folks that do that are rewarded with, more people want to participate in those type of networks.
Okay, I'll say one more thing. So I think that there is a need for more bottom-up control in general. I'm really happy that it is open source, like seriously. But the question is again, like, what can an average person do to modify their environment in certain ways? The reason I live in Philadelphia, I love it to death, is because the folks in Philly will take no shit. They will. Am I allowed to swear on this? Yeah. They will take. Thank you. They will take no shit, and they will just do what needs to be done in that environment to meet their needs. In a lot of cases, I mean, it's the community garden idea in a vacant lot, like that kind of thing. Closing down an alleyway to make it a play street, on the regular, not getting a permit, that kind of a thing, right? So I love that about the people there, because like I have so many wonderful photos of people putting like flower pots of a tree in a tree pit because it had nothing there, and they're just trying to make it better, because that's what we need to be able to have that impact on our space. So the more that we can do to allow for those kinds of changes in that way, I think the better. Obviously with some limitations, but I don't know. I guess I'm still a skeptic about a couple aspects. But I think that if I see it in action, then I think also that test will really help my brain with it too, if that makes sense. So I'm in favor of the experimentation. I think it deserves it, but I think it's a TBD.
Well, that's a perfect segue here, because Katrina, I would encourage you and everyone here to demo our partners' tech and to go see it for yourselves.
You're welcome.
But first, before you do that, can we get a round of applause for our partners and our panelists? It's been amazing. And thank you for all the questions. So again, I wasn't kidding about that. You should all, I would say, we have this room for another hour, so I encourage you all to stay, chat with each other, use the demos, talk to those folks. Some of us will be over at the Graduate Hotel's lobby at anything at all for the next hour or so. And then, as I mentioned, at 6 o'clock, the XR Guild folks will be having their meeting upstairs in room 225. And you're welcome to drop in and basically sort of learn from them and be recruited is basically what I'm trying to tell you to do.